Science,
engineering,
medicine,
chemistry,
physics,
biology, humanities, cardiology,
computing, public health, global
science communication.
Hello everyone, I'm Gareth Mitchell, and today the patients who took statins and reported side effects, but who also reported adverse effects when they took placebo sugar tablets.
The placebo effect, it's when you take a medicine that often because you believe it will help you, it does. Now, sugar tablets can also make you feel worse if you think they are going to make you feel worse. It's the opposite of the placebo effect. We call it the nocebo effect.
Yes, we'll explore that effect further. Also in this edition, a word with Robin Shattock, who's leading Imperial's COVID-19 vaccine research. And another prominent Imperial professor is in conversation with a former Prime Minister.
The Imperial College Podcast.
Right, well, as we always do, let's jump in with some news. Kate Whiten is here, and let's start by talking about this one, Kate, and it's a link between certain bowel conditions and depression. So what's going on here?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting study from this week which looked at inflammatory bowel disease. And inflammatory bowel disease affects about over 500,000 people in the UK. And it basically causes inflammation of the gut lining. It's an umbrella term for a couple of conditions called Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. It's sometimes confused with irritable bowel syndrome, but it's quite different. They don't really know what causes inflammatory bowel disease, but one theory is that the immune system malfunctions and starts to attack the gut lining. This can cause really upsetting symptoms like diarrhea, a lot of abdominal pain, makes people really, really uncomfortable, fatigue, vomiting. So it's a really quite nasty set of conditions. And this particular group from Imperial, but also from St George's, University College London and King's College London, looked at the patient records of around 15,000 people with inflammatory bowel disease and found that they were actually more likely to be diagnosed with depression up to 9 years before they were diagnosed with their bowel condition. And the researchers found this quite interesting because they're not sure that depression necessarily precipitates these conditions, but what could happen is that these patients were actually suffering from these symptoms for a long time before their diagnosis, and that could have actually caused them to be depressed because these do obviously affect a person's quality of life quite significantly.
So does that have treatment implications then? So, people present with one of these inflammatory bowel conditions. I don't know, does it just mean that the doctors should be more vigilant to the possibility of depression?
Exactly right. And also the clinicians, the doctors on this study, one of whom was Professor Sonia Saxena from Imperial School of Public Health, it's also a GP, was saying that actually for doctors, it can have some take-home messages in that if they have a patient come to them with anxiety, with depression, but they've also got other gut symptoms such as abdominal pain or diarrhea, then actually there could be something else underlying. So they could potentially have inflammatory bowel disease.
All right, Kate, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Kate Whiten. Now, Hayley Dunning joins us to talk about Chagas disease. And this is news of some new rapid testing that's been developed at Imperial. Tell me more about this, Hayley.
Yeah, so Chagas disease affects actually around 8 million people, primarily in Latin America. And it's a slightly tricky disease to tackle because it's caused by a parasite, which is called the kissing bug, but it comes in several different strains. And it's difficult to differentiate between those strains. But this new test can tell the difference between those strains, and it does it with just a drop of blood.
How does it do that?
So the parasite has on its outside, on its coating, several different kinds of sugars. And these are different depending on the different strains of the parasite. Now, what this test does is it kind of acts a little bit like the immune system. When it senses these proteins, these sugars, it tags them with antibodies. And this new test detects the antibodies that recognise the different sugars.
What is significant about this test?
Well, one of the problems with Chagas disease is that the initial symptoms are quite mild, which makes detection difficult without diagnostic tests. So the fact that it can be done with a droplet of blood is helpful, but also differentiating between the 6 actual groups of the parasite, which tend to vary by geographical region, can help get the right treatment quickly. Chagas disease, by the way, is what they call a neglected tropical disease. So if left untreated, it can cause permanent damage to the heart, nervous system, and intestines and lead to lifelong disability and death. So it's something well worth treating.
Great. Hayley, thank you very much indeed for that. That's Hayley Dunning, and we also heard there from Kate Whiten. Well, now you may have seen some of the headlines over the last week or so about the study that found that patients reported side effects whether they were taking statins or placebo dummy tablets. In other words, this Imperial and Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust-led research identifies a nocebo effect. The trial involved 60 patients who'd previously taken statins but discontinued them after reporting significant side effects. The study patients were given jars containing either statins, placebo tablets, or nothing, just empty jars. And over a succession of months, the patients moved from one type of jar to the next, whilst also keeping a daily log of how they felt on a scale of great to terrible. So what did the research reveal? Maxine Myers has been hearing from Imperial Clinical Research Fellow Dr. James Howard, who's also a cardiologist at Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust.
We found that when people weren't taking tablets, they generally felt quite well, but they felt a lot worse when they were taking statins. But they also felt a lot worse when they were taking placebo. And in fact, 90% of the extra symptoms people got from taking a statin tablet was also present when they took a sugar tablet. And the other interesting thing we found was that when we sat down with our 60 patients, all of who believed that they could never take statins again, when we showed them their personalised results and their breakdowns and when they were getting symptoms, half of them, 6 months later, were back taking statins again.
This effect that you talk about, the sort of the same types of side effects experienced on the statins and the placebo, is called the nocebo effect. Can you just explain a little bit about that and what it is?
The placebo effect, which is much more famous, most people know it's when you take a medicine that isn't thought to do you any benefit, but often because you believe it will help you, it does. And it's much more complex than just being fooled. There are actually biochemical things going on in the human body that make you feel better when you take a sugar tablet, when you have faith in the medicine. Now, sugar tablets can also make you feel worse if you think they are going to make you feel worse. It's the opposite of the placebo effect. We call it the nocebo effect. And we think that was the cause of the majority of the symptoms in our trial.
Were you surprised to see this nocebo effect play out in terms of the results during this trial?
Well, what's very interesting about statins, and the reason why we did this trial in the first place, was there were 2 reasons why people, when they come and see us in clinics, so often complain of statin tablets. And we thought the 2 possible explanations are, one of them is this nocebo ratio, the tablets are making them feel worse. The other one, though, is patients often come to see us at an age where they're starting to get arthritis, they're starting to get aches and pains of being older, and it may be that the tablets aren't making them feel worse, but when these new aches and pains associated with getting older happen, they realise that it might be due to the statins, and they attribute it to them. And we wanted to design this trial so we could tease those 2 phenomena apart, whether it's the nocebo effect or whether it's background symptoms. And in fact, it does seem to be mainly the nocebo effect.
Obviously, there's clear benefits for taking statins. I mean, how big a problem is it when patients then, because of perceived side effects, stop taking their statins? And what could be the downsides of doing that?
If you have never had a heart attack before, but your cholesterol is very high, the most likely thing you are to die from is heart disease or stroke, cardiovascular disease. Statins help with that, but it's probably that most people that take statins don't get a benefit. However, 23% of the patients in Samson were taking statins because they had already had heart attacks or stents or bypass grafts. And as soon as you start talking about patients like that, it starts becoming something we see clinically. But when we're in the hospital and we're putting stents and we're doing bypass grafts and things like that, we can actually see the differences in patients who take their statins and patients who aren't able to take them when we look at angiograms and we see how much narrowing there is. So for those patients, it is a particularly important problem.
are the implications of this study then? What do you think could be the next steps that come out in terms of clinical benefits for patients and how doctors perhaps liaise with patients?
There's kind of three ways that Samson might change things. The first is hopefully it will change the conversations we have with patients and how we educate patients about the nocebo effect and how we discuss the side effects people suffer from. The second thing is it may be that in the future, when we have patients with side effects, we are able to do small experiments at the patient level like we did in Samson. We will be able to say, okay, would you be happy to experiment and see, using this phone app and this batch of tablets, whether or not statins are worse for you than placebo tablets? Because that's what we did in Samson. We were able to tell every patient an individualised nocebo score. And it may be that that would make a big difference to patients. And I think the third way that Samson may change things is I suspect a lot of people are going to look at our trial design and say, that will be really helpful in our disease. So already within another group of clinicians within the college, we've just submitted a grant to look at certain medications in heart failure patients who find they're not able to take tablets that otherwise we know save lives. And there's no reason why this has to be limited to cardiology or cardiovascular disease. It could be used for anything, whether it's an inhaler. The one thing it probably can't be used for are things like surgical procedures, because you have to be able to stop the treatment and start it again several times. And of course, you can't put an appendix back in, for example, once you've taken it out.
James Howard talking there to Maxine Myers. So, at long last, good news has been breaking out in the fight against the pandemic as a number of the vaccine trials around the world report encouraging results. But that's not stopping concern over the safety of these new vaccines amongst some people. And then, of course, there are all those conspiracy theories. Well, Imperial's Ryan O'Hare has been speaking to Professor Robin Shattock about Imperial's own COVID-19 vaccine and about the many challenges ahead for all those working on the scientific response to the pandemic. Now, we should say that this interview is recorded before the results of the Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines were announced.
I think it's exciting that there are so many vaccines that are in late clinical evaluation. But we need to remember that you won't wake up one morning to hear a vaccine's been shown to work and the following day get the vaccine. It's still going to be a huge logistical challenge to go from showing something works to making it available.
So, Robin, when we first spoke all the way back in February, there were only a handful of vaccines in development, and there are currently more than 150 vaccines in development around the world, and about 40 of these that we know of in clinical trials. And one of these is your own. What's it been like to lead a team at the forefront of vaccine research in a global pandemic?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting experience to go from really ground zero, nothing, to large clinical testing. It's like a race, and we started with a sprint, but increasingly we realise that this is a marathon and we need to pace ourselves.
How have the early stages of the research gone, and where are we up to at the moment?
The good news is that, in the early stage of testing, it looks to be extremely safe. We're seeing immune responses related to the dose of vaccine. And we're now exploring exactly which dose is going to be optimal to give us the best immune response while minimising any side effects. And that's really where we are right now. And that's quite a crucial stage. The other part is thinking about not just making a vaccine for a clinical study, but preparing ourselves so that if it is successful, how can we manufacture significant amounts of vaccine?
What are the next steps, and what might the next 6 months bring for the Imperial vaccine?
Between now and the end of the year, we will know whether our vaccine induces sufficient immune response to move into a large-scale efficacy trial. If that's the case, we will be moving into a trial of at least 20,000 individuals to see if the vaccine prevents infection and to see whether it prevents severe disease, so people having to go to hospital. That will be a big watershed for us. The alternative is we may get to the end of the year and see that it's worked, but it's not competitive, and we may, struggle to get the funds for those large-scale trials if at that stage people feel there's no longer a need for our approach. And so we're in that kind of middle ground at the moment. We don't know what the future will look like. We're preparing for the best outcome, but aware that we may also find that actually, the moment has passed, in which case we would actually look at improving the vaccine, improving the technology for the next pandemic. So the efforts that we've put into this already are improving our preparedness for the next time that this happens.
One of the aspects that we've unfortunately seen growing throughout this pandemic is growing anti-science sentiment against 5G masks, against epidemiology and modelling, and growing anti-science sentiment against vaccines. Does this enter your mind at all? Is it disappointing? Does it make you mad or depressed to see this going on?
Human behaviour is always interesting, fascinating. I believe in evidence. I believe in transparent evidence. And these vaccines are being conducted to the highest ethical and scientific standards. People will always have concerns about something new, but we all take medicines every day. If you read the side effects in a packet of even paracetamol, and actually if you read them all and thought they were all going to happen to you, you'd take no medicine at all. Vaccines are one of the safest intervention strategies in the world and have saved more lives than any other public health measure other than clean water. And so the track record is there. In terms of COVID-19, the real question to ask is, if you're somebody who's having to self-isolate, if you're a vulnerable person, if you're an elderly person who's frightened to go out of the house right now, would you be worried about getting a vaccine? I suspect not. So we need to ensure that vaccines are made available to those that are at highest risk so that they're protected. Now, there may be individuals who still choose not to take a vaccine based on the evidence that's out there, but ultimately it comes down to personal choice.
That's Robin Shattock talking there to Ryan O'Hare. Well, whilst the scientific response to the pandemic has seen cooperation between teams all over the world, it's been a rather different story when it comes to the political and geopolitical response. That was one of the conclusions in a special video marking the 1-year anniversary of the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute for Disease and Emergency Analysis, in which the Institute's director, Professor Neil Ferguson, spoke to Tony Blair, who started by saying what has surprised him so far about the pandemic.
The most surprising thing for me has been the absence of global coordination and political leadership on what is an unprecedented crisis. The biggest challenge that government has ever faced in terms of scale, logistics, and it's been completely global. In other words, all countries face basically the same problem with their own context and circumstances, but essentially the same problem. How do you cut down the disease, control it, or eradicate it? And yet the global leadership that you would expect in such a situation has just not been present. And if it had been, I think we would have all got through this a lot quicker.
Yes, and it's a paradox that scientifically there has been immense coordination. I was on a call this weekend with many scientific leaders across Europe, but it hasn't materialised in the political sense. And so where do you think we are now? From an economic and political perspective, how do you see the next 6 months unfolding?
I think there's going to be a major question as to whether we get vaccines and therapeutics out of the door quicker. Without mass testing, it's hard to get a handle on the disease. And we have had in recent times the development of much more accurate rapid tests. And I think measuring whether people are infectious is as important as measuring whether they actually have the disease, because some people have a very light viral load, very light form of the disease. Many people are asymptomatic. But I think getting to the 4 elements of this that are necessary, vaccines, therapeutics, testing, and then the other thing, which is data, having the ability to track what's happening and assemble, real-time data, those are the big challenges, I think. And if we rise to those challenges, then I think there is light at the end of the tunnel and we can get through this. But if we don't, then the economic damage of a further heavy lockdown, if it takes us till spring or summer next year to really get on top of this, or longer, then I think we're going to face an unprecedented economic situation.
Yes, I'm struck, and you must find this in your conversations, by how similar, at least across Europe, the challenges being faced by politicians, by communities are.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that you realize about this type of situation in government is you've got to get really organized as a government. One of the hardest things is not taking the decision, but actually identifying what the decision is. And then I think there's been an inability on the part of political leaders to distinguish where science ends and judgment begins. So for governments, this is such a difficult question because it is always in the nature of bureaucratic systems to be somewhat small c conservative in the actions they take, because you will always get punished as a government for acts of commission, but acts of omission tend to get less punished.
And I think understanding exponentially growing risk is a challenge in many policy circles. I see at the moment a trade-off between being played out in the media and the political discourse of, is it society or is it health? But the fact is, if we allow case numbers to rise ever more, the health service in any country will not be able to cope with the pressures.
If the case numbers rise in a huge way, and so people find a second wave like the first wave, then quite apart from whatever the government says, people won't have confidence. And if they don't have confidence, of course, that has a huge economic and health impact. People decide, I don't want to go for my checkup in hospital because I'm too frightened to go. Or I'm maybe permitted to travel to work, but I don't feel safe traveling.
I agree. It's going to be a very difficult few months. And I think clear communication and having a strategy and objectives you're wanting to meet would help a lot. And I think it's not a criticism of this government, but I see across Europe, across the world, very reactive policy making.
And the other thing is that you've got to make sure that the things that you're asking people to do are consistent with each other. If people feel that the rules don't make sense, then your compliance drops. And one of the huge problems we have in the UK is compliance has dropped. I think one other issue which is very difficult is the degree to which, and I think politicians find this very challenging, how far are the public prepared to go in accepting quite tough surveillance in order to get on top of the disease? Because if you look at a country like South Korea, they have taken some measures on surveillance pretty close to what they did in China. In other words, very, very tough measures. Now, South Korea is a democracy, China isn't. But the point is, it was essential for them to get on top of the disease that this surveillance was put in place. And we prepared to do that. Now, I think the public's prepared for some quite draconian measures if they see it's according to a plan and it actually can work. It's where you appear to be changing all the time or quite uncertain and not really explaining it to people, people lose confidence.
And you can see more of that interview on the Jameel Institute's YouTube channel. And speaking of YouTube, that's where you can also access this podcast alongside lots of other places where we are available, the likes of iTunes, Spotify, Entail and SoundCloud. So basically, where you want us, that's where you'll find us. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. We'll have more for you next month. But for now, from me, Gareth Mitchell, and all of us on the podcast team, take care and goodbye.